to you today in my capacity as one of the tour leaders for the John Baines Midwifery tours. I've travelled very widely with John Baines, and I've also travelled quite a lot on my own account. But I'm going to refer quite a lot to UK midwifery today, because that's where I've got all my working experience. But I know if those of you from Australia, your system is very similar to the UK, so I hope you can draw out the relevance of my talk. There's no doubt at all that these are strange times, and I hope everybody's staying well. And I hope all of you who've joined this virtual discussion are going to look forward to a more normal future. But despite the importance of COVID-19, both in our own countries and in the poorer countries of the world, that isn't what I'm going to talk to you about today. What I thought I'd do today is two things. One is, I think it's really helpful when you travel and observe midwifery services, maternity services in other parts of the world, to have a framework through which you kind of look at those services and think about what you're witnessing and try and put what you're observing in some kind of context. So in that light, I want to talk to you about a framework for looking at maternity services, which I think is really useful. I also think it's really important, if you are getting a chance to travel and observe maternity services, to think about what that's telling you about the maternity services in your own country. So once I've told you about the framework, I just want to tell you a few things that always occur to me about UK midwifery in particular, but it really is very similar in Australia, as I look at how people are struggling to provide care in poorer countries, in other countries of the world. So first of all, to talk about the framework, and what I want to take you to do is take you right back to 2014, when the Lancet in its September issue presented a framework for quality maternal and newborn care. This framework, which was based on a very extensive literature review and analysis by academics, many of whom are well known to you, both in the UK and Australia and from other areas of the world. This framework describes what women and babies need if they are to receive high quality maternity care. And the authors of the Lancet series called this framework midwifery. Midwifery, the Lancet reported, is a vital solution to the challenges of providing high quality maternal and newborn care for all women and newborn infants in all countries of the globe. Now, the critical thing, as the authors were at pains to point out, both in the journal at the time and in many subsequent lectures, is that the term midwifery didn't necessarily equate to the term midwives. And that's quite confusing. But to the contrary, the framework, the authors of the Lancet series pointed out that the framework could, in theory, be delivered without midwives, or with midwives as a small part of the framework. However, and extremely importantly, the Lancet also concluded that the most cost-effective and efficient way of providing high-quality maternity services was to use midwives. And they argued that the countries in which midwifery was being delivered, the framework of midwifery, there tended to be a high-quality profession of midwives. So the hope of many who read the Lancet was that this framework would influence countries around the world to develop a strong profession of midwives. But it is important to remember that the framework of midwifery is not the same as talking about midwives. So as I've said, this framework is very useful to use when you're observing midwifery and maternity services in other countries. So I want now just to describe this framework. And the important thing about the framework is that it has 5 key components. And each of these components is absolutely critical if we want to deliver the highest quality maternity care. And the first important component is practice. Now, this makes absolute sense. I suppose it's a kind of no-brainer, isn't it? That if you want women and babies to receive the best possible care, you've got to have all of the practice that they need in place. In other words, you need to provide the clinical pathway that everyone needs. And this clinical pathway, if the care is going to be of high quality, must include what we would routinely call preconception care. It must include things like education, information, and postnatal care, advice on feeding and so on. So there needs to be this strong education and informative piece to clinical care. And of course, in many countries, that is lacking. Then what you need is antenatal care. And again, in some countries, the quality of antenatal care is very different from others. Then you need labour care, and there's particular emphasis in the practice component of the framework on the importance of normal labour, the importance of ensuring that women can labour normally, that their labours can be kept as normal as possible, and that they can birth normally. But of course, everything doesn't always go to plan. So the fourth aspect of the practice component is that you have to have the clinical services available for women to have care in first-line emergency situations. You have to have the availability of services to stop postpartum hemorrhage and so on and so forth. And then finally, in the practice component of the framework, you need the bit of the bit that has non-midwives in it. You need the medical help, the anaesthetic help, the neonatal help for when things are complicated and going wrong. So, first component of the framework, practice, and that covers the entire clinical pathway of care. Then the second critical component of the framework is the organisation of care. And what the authors of the Lancet series concluded was that if women were to have the highest quality care possible and their babies, then the critical aspects of this component of the framework were that care must be available to women. There's no point providing maternity services if women can't afford those services. It must be accessible. There's no point providing services if women can't get to them. Very importantly, the service must be acceptable to the women who are receiving it. The service must be adequately resourced, otherwise you can't possibly provide high quality care, and there must be a competent workforce. There's no point having doctors, midwives, nurses available to women if they don't have the clinical competencies. So how care is organised is critical, and it must be organised with those kind of issues addressed. Now, those two aspects of the framework are probably pretty obvious. You have to have clinical services and you have to provide them. The next aspects of the framework, though, are perhaps less obvious, and they tend to be the ones that aren't so readily present in a lot of countries. So the third component of a framework of high quality care is that the service must be provided with the right values. And values are very important if women are to get care that's of the highest quality. And what are the values that are important? The service must value the women attending the service. The services must respect the women. They must value two-way communication with the woman. And particularly importantly, there must be value placed on community knowledge. Where do these women that we're providing care for come from? What do they care about? Let's value their community. Let's think about how we can show respect for this community. And again, the authors of the Lancet series concluded that unless those kind of values existed, it was very hard to provide the highest quality services. And linked to values is the fourth component of the framework. What's the philosophy of care? Does it matter what the philosophy of care is? And the authors of the Lancet series concluded that it was really important that a particular philosophy existed. And they argue that the philosophy of care that will lead to the highest quality of service is one which says, we believe in optimizing the biological, social, and cultural processes of childbirth. If you have a philosophy that only values physical safety, you will miss something. You won't provide the highest quality care. You have to care about the wider components of childbirth, the wider influence of childbirth. And included in that philosophy should be the one that we've all heard of, not intervening when unnecessary, but intervening when necessary. So optimizing normal birth becomes a very important aspect of the philosophy. And the final component of the framework relates to the caregivers themselves. Obviously, the caregivers must have clinical knowledge. But if you then link through to the value aspect of the framework and the philosophical aspect of the framework, the caregivers must also be competent in terms of interpersonal skills, and they must be competent culturally. And, you know, we've all in our careers met midwives who are fantastically well skilled. They can keep any woman safe, but the women don't actually particularly like them because they're hopeless communicators. So this issue of being able to communicate, able to talk to women and to understand where they come from is incredibly important. So that is the framework that the Lancet authors argued would lead to, if provided, would lead to the highest quality care for women and their newborns. And it's really critical to remember that all of these components are incredibly important. And you can't have four of them and miss out the fifth. You can't have one without the others. And I thought I'd just run through a very simple example of why it's important that all of the bits of the framework interact with each other and what happens when they don't. So take a country where the maternal mortality is really high, and you've got policymakers worrying themselves sick about this. They really want to do something about it. They don't want women to be dying in childbirth. They know that it's got terrible consequences for families and for communities. And they also know that the mortality is strongly connected, closely connected with very lengthy labours, delayed caesarean sections, massive postpartum hemorrhages, and tied to the failure for women to be looked after by competent caregivers. So they think about this, these policymakers, and they decide, oh, and this, in this country, most of the women are giving birth in their villages, really very rural villages. So the policymakers decide that what they're going to do is build a facility. They're going to build facilities around the country which are centralized, where they can then staff these facilities with people that they train to give high quality care. Bingo, they've got a solution. They're also not stupid, and they know that the women they're providing services with are really poor, and that for them to do the 20-mile journey or the 10-mile journey to the centralized clinic presents a problem. So they decide that they will fund any woman who's pregnant and coming up to the point of labour and birth to travel to the centralised clinic. So they deal with that issue. And they then expect women to leave their villages, come to the central facility and be supported to give birth. And they hope that this will be the solution to their high maternity policy, high maternal mortality. But lo and behold, what happens is that the women don't come to the clinic, or some of them come to the clinic and then others don't. And it seems like this is not a very acceptable service to the women. And remember that services have to be acceptable. So what's gone wrong? So the policymakers start trying to find out what's gone wrong. They send in a researcher. And of course, what do they discover? When the women come to the clinic, they are physically looked after, but nobody's very kind to them. And instead of being looked after with their family surrounding them, with all the cultural traditions being implemented when the baby's born, the baby's delivered, the baby's put in a cot in a different room because the belief is that's safer. And they're completely alone, these women, during the course of their labour. They have no support. So women don't feel respected. They don't feel anyone's asked them what they want. And they choose to stay in their village and give birth with people who do value them and who do respect their cultures. And that's a real life story that happened in India. And basically what really was obvious is that the policymakers paid a lot of attention to the first two components of the framework. They provided clinical care and they organized care in a way they thought was sensible, but they didn't consider the values, philosophy of the women they were providing care for. And the caregivers didn't have the interpersonal and cultural competencies to overcome the problem of the women being removed from their familiar surrounding. So that's the kind of way the framework works. And I hope that you can see how critical it is if we are going to strive as midwives or in whatever role we are to provide the highest quality services around the world. It's very, very important that all aspects of this framework are considered. And I think that the Lancet series was incredibly important and very powerful. And there is general understanding now that what you might call the softer elements of the framework matter. And of course, the reason why in countries which have a strong midwifery profession in place probably find it easier to deliver this kind of quality of service is that the midwives provide the kind of holistic care that incorporates all elements of the framework. And in the UK, we've just had a fantastic new midwifery curriculum introduced for the training of our midwives. And it's very much based on the Lancet framework. And there is as much attention paid in this curriculum to the sort of interpersonal and cultural elements of competence as there is to clinical competence. So I'm outlining that framework today in the hopes that some of you, I know you've all travelled, but hopefully some of you will travel more. And I just think it's a really useful way of looking at services and trying to work out what aspects countries aren't quite achieving. I mean, I remember being with midwives who were travelling with me, and we were in India, and the public services in India are really struggling, and quite a lot of services are provided by charities. And I remember going to this community-based maternity service with midwives, and these midwives were so shocked because there were two midwives, two women lying in beds so close to each other you couldn't really put an envelope between the beds. One woman was delivering a healthy term baby, and the woman next to her was losing a 23-week baby. You know, and both women were going to come out of that experience physically safe. There wasn't really any doubt about that. The people looking after them were competent in terms of clinical care. But there was absolutely no attention being paid to the emotional elements. There really wasn't a lot of respect for the women. Now, obviously, that's not the fault of people delivering the service. You know, they were doing their best. They just hadn't really had the education and understanding to do anything differently. And it wouldn't have taken a lot of money to change that, even a little bit. And I've seen midwives on my travels who are doing fantastic things to try and change this. I mean, midwives in Nepal introducing birth centres in really midwifery-led sections of their units, where they're really treating the women with very, very different sense of respect than in the main labour wards. So there are people doing a really good job at changing this. So hold that framework in mind, and if you're travelling or if you're travelling with other midwives, it's well worth discussing it, talking it through with people, and sort of gets a good chat going, really. Now, I'm sort of romping on a bit because I know that time is short, but I did want to, just in the second little bit of this talk, just talk to you a little bit about my own reflections as I look at other countries, about what is positive about UK midwifery and Australian midwifery indeed. And the three things that I really, really value in the UK, which I think midwives often forget about, is we are so lucky here to have a maternity service that is based on the concept that midwives provided. And I think we need to keep saying to midwives in the UK and indeed in Australia, you know, we are really important, and our values and our philosophy matter to women. And the fact that midwives are with women, that we value their cultures, we value their how they feel about things, we mustn't lose that. We must remember that women need to be at the centre of care. And if we don't provide them with the services that they want and they value, they will vote with their feet. We'll get the situation where we start to hear about women birthing at home on their own. I know that's a tiny, tiny little number in the UK at the moment, but you know, it could grow if we don't show respect for women. And when women are on the other side of the spectrum and walk in wanting interventionist care, we mustn't condemn them for being stupid or not understanding. We must value that that's what they want. talk to them about it and understand what their fears are, and see if we can help them work out what they could choose that would allay those fears without subjecting them to unnecessary intervention. But we must value our profession, and we must value the fact that we are highly educated, well-regulated and autonomous professionals, because that doesn't exist in many, many countries of the world, and they struggle to provide the high quality care because of that. The other thing I think we must value is the fact that we've got a health service that is available to women and free at the point of access. I think that's incredibly important. Around the world, the provision of private care alongside public care hugely distorts the resources that are available to women. And I don't think we're at great risk of losing our national health service in any way, but boy, is it important in terms of providing high quality care. And we must fight to hang on to that. Almost without exception, in countries I've visited, where there is a large private sector used by the well-off and powerful, the public services are way worse, and you get huge discrepancies in the quality of care. And finally, I think we should value, and I think that one last thing, I think this is something that doesn't really occur to midwives very often. I'm less confident about how it works in Australia, I must admit, but in the UK, the fact that we are salaried professionals is really important. In many countries, again, around the world, the medical profession in particular is kind of paid per item of care, which means that it's much less likely that you'll have a collaborative system and respect for each other's separate competencies. And the fact that we're not fighting each other over the care of individual women and who gets to support a normal labour is really, really important, I think. High quality care is hugely dependent on all professionals respecting each other's roles and collaborating together. And I think we forget that these things we take for granted actually become part of supporting people to deliver the framework that I've described. Now, Emma's letting me know that I'm really out of time, so I will stop now and just say it's been lovely to talk to you. I really hope many of you will consider coming on a trip with me again. I'd love to be with you again. And I'd love to meet new people as well. So if anybody listens to this recording and wants to join a John Baines midwifery tour, I would just love to have some of these chats in person, hear what you think, have a good debate, and enjoy ourselves as well on the cultural and more social aspects of the tour. And just in case anyone hasn't looked at the brochure, I'm going to Peru, hopefully in November, 14th to the 25th, coronavirus willing, and Japan on the 16th to the 28th of May. So lovely to talk to you. I don't know if we've got time for questions, Emma, but back to you.